Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to offer dana, then please do go to justthiszen.org/giving. Your support really does make a huge difference. Thank you so much.
Lovely spring day. So I hope, yes, I hope you've all been able to take some advantage, if the weather has been lovely, of the vitality of spring. That's what I'm kind of really noticing at the moment. And I was going to talk tonight about something that I'm kind of rather endlessly intrigued by, which is this sort of notion of self and being yourself, and so many ways in which this idea sort of threads through our practice. And as a psychotherapist of many years and a Zen student, and also, by the by, a human being, I've been really interested in this whole question of self, because people come, for therapy often because they don't feel like they're being themselves, or they don't know who themselves is, or what that means, or how to be it, or it feels like something that we really dance with, many of us, during the most of our lives, because of course, as everything is impermanent, ourselves are also shifting sands, a working self, a not working self, a active self, or an ill self. It's like they're not quite the same things for us. We often have to do a lot of adjusting to the different selves that we become during the course of our lives. Um, and so it's, there's a lovely little phrase which I kind of often say, is you may as well be yourself because everyone else is taken. But but there's a kind of trickiness about, well, what does that actually even mean? When I was teaching person-centered counseling, Carl Rogers talked about, our actualizing tendency, a little bit like the vitality of spring, this emergent need for expression, and the organismic self, not the orgasmic self, that too, but the organismic self. And it's that he saw that as a kind of self that wasn't constrained by our conditioning or our histories or the need to comply with society's rules and all of those sorts of things. And he thought that the organismic self, an expression of the organismic self, would be pro-social and flexible and responsive to the moment in life as it is, which I think many of us would kind of recognize as something that we often think of as kind of, Buddha nature. That Buddha nature are those sorts of expressions of a soft, flexible mind, being responsive to life. And he also suggested that a successful and useful therapist would offer three conditions to the client. He talked about empathy and congruence and something he called unconditional positive regard. And when we were teaching those, teaching students, and we'd kind of really separate them out. Like there is this thing called empathy, and there is this thing called congruence, and there is this thing called unconditional positive regard. But it's kind of like a really Janet and John version. It's a kind of very beginning version, and as you're practicing, you realize more and more that the qualities kind of interweave, and it's a little bit like you can't do one without including the others. And there's ways in which I think many of the things that we're kind of supported to do are an interweaving of qualities and conditions. Um, there's a phrase recently that I think somebody said in one of their talks, and it was Emily Dickinson. And it wasn't a poem, which I didn't realize until just recently, but it was a letter to a friend following a very disorganized move of her house. And her belongings had been scattered rather than arriving in one place. And she said, "I'm out with lanterns looking for myself." And I've always really liked that phrase, "I'm out with lanterns looking for myself." And she actually meant it. She was looking for her belongings. But I think often we're here, our sitting practice is a little bit like us being out with lanterns looking for ourselves, and the lanterns are the teachings and our sitting and our connection with each other. What's going to shine a light on some of these things that either have got locked up or seem to have kind of gone missing. And one of the phrases that we come round and round to, if you've been around the Sangha a while, would be Dogen's phrase of "to study the Buddha way is to study the self." To study the self is to forget the self. That's a really interesting notion, isn't it? It's like the more you actually study this self, the more the self loses its concrete edges, the more it becomes a response to life rather than a thing. And as we forget the self, to forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. So life, the only teacher. So that's what we chant as well, life, the only teacher. The myriad things are life, we are actualized by life coming towards us, moving through us, by us meeting it. And when actualized by myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the body and mind of others, drop away. The less you're attached to your view of yourself, the less you're actually attached to the view of others' self, the less you kind of take it seriously in some way. And the little phrase ends with "no trace of realization remains," and this no trace continues endlessly. There's no trace, but the no trace continues endlessly. And we could spend weeks just on that one, couldn't we? But I'm kind of heading off in a slightly different direction because I'm really interested in how would we have some sense of this self and how it is in the world. The closer we are to our Buddha nature, the less constrained and contracted we are by our beliefs. What might we see and what do we already see in each other? I see these things. But it's like, what does it actually, how might it manifest? And towards the very end of his teaching, sorry, I've just looked up and seen the most amazing moon. Good Lord. If you have a moment, you must try and catch a really big, glorious fat moon. Anyway. So, the idea was towards the end of his life, one of his last teachings of the Buddha was he talked about the 8 qualities of a great person. And like the precepts, they aren't something they're not a new suit of clothes. It's not a new suit of armor. It's like what is expressed when we're closer to the idea of this sense of expressing our Buddha nature in our actual lives. So it's like as our conditioned, contracted self, softens and drops away, what do we see? And it is this kind of fluid response to life as it is. So the 8 qualities that he talked about were, the first one is having few desires, shoyoku. And my excuse is I'm a Taurian. We like things. I've had a long dance with desire in my life, and we can desire many, many things. We can desire objects, we can desire connection, love, approbation, status, world peace. That there's a whole lot of things that we can really desire, some of them marvelous and some of them much more kind of egotistical and individualistic. But desires will always pull you away from somewhere, that they don't move you into life as it actually is. Because the desire is nearly always for something that isn't there, or the cessation of something that is there. We might desire the cessation of fear or pain or suffering or loneliness. But they're desires and they pull us away from life as it is. He says the first quality is having few desires. That is, not wildly chasing after the objects of one's desires of the five senses, and not chasing after them when they haven't been fulfilled is what's called having few desires. So you recognize there are things that you don't have or things that you do have that are maybe difficult or problematical, and that's just how it is. You're not chasing something. And you're not dragged around by cravings. And I thought, I was thinking about myself and my very strong desires that I've often had. And when we moved to a place called Southport, when we had a young child and went on to have another child there, we lived in the very eponymously named Railway Terrace. So our front garden looked out on the railway. I quite liked the trains, but it was all my friends literally lived on the other side of the tracks. And they lived in big, posh, rather grand, often Victorian houses in what was then posh Birkdale. And I had a lot of desire. I saw our little 2 up, 2 down as being very lacking in what I saw in my friends' houses. And then we moved to Lancaster and we moved into what was essentially a pretty run-down house, but it was much more similar to the model of house that I'd lusted after. And I immediately just changed my lust to the houses that run along the canal on all. It's like, oh no, now I've got this one. I really want that one. And it was really interesting to notice that I'd got the thing that was really close to the thing that I'd been wanting for quite a few years. And it just changed. And I became really interested in how the skill set of desire is about acquisition. It's not about completion. Desire is nearly always about, now I've got this one. I'm not actually going to spend any time with it. I'm just going to miss, because desire is about acquisition. It's not really about enoughness. And knowing one has enough, Chisoku, is the next condition that the Buddha talked about. The second realization of a great person is knowing when one has had enough, limiting how much to accept of what you've already received and knowing that's enough. And it's whatever you've received in whatever situation you're in. There's a quite a famous line from one of the teachers, which is, thank you very much, I've got no complaints whatsoever. And it's like that space of like, I don't have to have something else here to make this how I think it should be. And the third quality is appreciating serenity or quietude. I can't pronounce the name that goes with this one. And the third quality is enjoying peace of mind. and it's characterized by avoiding noisy, bustling places that confuse the mind and living alone in a quiet, serene dwelling. That made me laugh. Anyway, there's something about that that seemed to me infinitely more possible in rural India 2000 years ago. But I was thinking now, most of us are not going to live in that kind of serene dwelling. But how do we make our interior world become that place of peace? How do we quiet the noise? And, as something of a social media addict, it's like, how do I quiet the amount of input that I allow myself to make? How can I have a quieter mind? And the fourth quality is making diligent effort. It's about persevering. I think a phrase that was used recently was kind of sort of steady resoluteness or resolute uprightness. There's something about, just carrying on, not being attached to the outcomes, like it didn't work, so I'm not doing it anymore. It did work, so I'm going to do it loads. It's like, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to keep doing, keep carrying out, continuously striving. The Buddha said, continuously striving to carry out deeds that are true and wholesome is making diligent effort. And it means to be energetic, to not being sloppy or crude. It's like doing things with with appamada, with diligent care. And the fifth one is not losing sight of true dharma. And it's called observing the true teaching, and it means maintaining and keeping sight of the dharma. So in a way, it's like not losing sight, not thinking, oh, I'm having a holiday now, I'm putting my practice down. It's like, now I'm not doing it. It's like every moment is an opportunity for practice in any circumstance that we're in. That's, folds into the diligent practice. And the sixth realization is practicing dhyana, abiding in Buddha Dharma and remaining undisturbed. So it's kind of like returning again and again to our sitting practice, again and again to the steady upright sitting, and watching the flow of your mind and the flow of life, and just coming back, starting again. We fall off these, I do, all the time. But there's something about actually my commitment and the vows we take are coming back, just coming back. Success or failure, just coming back. And the seventh quality is to embody the wisdom of liberation. So noticing what happens when you're free from all of that clinging and attachment and aversion. So it's kind of practicing wisdom, noticing what supports you in a wholesome life is kind of practicing wisdom. Is it wise to do this right now? Is it wise to have a really noisy mind? Is it wise to speak ill of someone? Is it wise? Just really noticing how you might do that. And there's a very long and beautiful, well, quite long and beautiful description from the Buddha. It said, true wisdom, like a strong and durable boat, will ferry you and others. We don't do it for ourselves. You and others across the sea of sickness, old age, and death. It is like a brilliant lamp that lights up ignorance and darkness. It is medicine for all who are sick and infirm. It's like cutting down the tree of ignorance, hatred, and cravings with a sharp axe. So it's kind of like the invitation is for us to be a ferry person, a light, a woodsman, medicine, just by living as who we are, this self, this intriguing self. And the last one I found really interesting in the light of the rise of social media, the rise of argumentativeness, the rise of living in a very polarized world, and it's not engaging in spurious talk or useless argument. And the eighth quality is not involving oneself in spurious talk or useless argument that is not beneficial. So it's not getting caught up in illusory discrimination and not engaging in useless argument. There was a lovely little quote from Cohen Franz that just came through on the newsletter from Nothing Special. It says, if you want to let go of attachment to the importance of your own views, just don't say them all the time. Isn't that a great practice? If you want to let go of the attachment to the importance of your views, just don't say them all the time. Which is a very interesting thing to say in the middle of giving a talk, where I'm just saying quite a lot. But there is something about that, really noticing how holding on to opinions sets one against something. You know, it's nearly always a kind of a binary position. And on Tuesday, Flint gave a really beautiful talk about the shape and function of the Buddha's mind as encapsulated in the three pure principles. And I'd really recommend, listening to the whole talk. But he says, when we take the precepts, we say the three pure principles, and in an original, he gave the original translation, then he distilled them down and down into a way of living and conducting ourselves in the world in accord with the Buddha's mind and heart, to live the way. So the three pure principles in the original are embracing and sustaining standards of conduct, embracing and sustaining good actions, and embracing and sustaining all beings. And because when we take the precepts, we're taking them in the form of a vow, the way we say them in the precept ceremony is, I vow to refrain from all harming, I vow to do what is life-giving, and I vow to live and be lived for the benefit of all beings, which is one of the ones I find really a great reminder. Like, what am I doing right now? What am I doing in this instant? Is there a way that I could be living and being lived for the benefit of all beings in this precise moment? And the simplest way of saying this, he said at the end, was to preserve life. Take good care of it. Take good care of the precious life you have, and the precious life others have, and the precious life around you. And nourish life, encourage and support it, and plunge into life. Don't hold back. That's that diligent effort, So these lists are really, clearly there's something about the Buddhist way that is a great lover of lists. And sometimes I find the lists really helpful. And sometimes they seem to, for me, they can be a little bit of an invitation to failure. I haven't done all 8 today. I've barely managed one. There's a way in which it can be really helpful compass points, and for me, something of a stumbling block sometimes. And then as I was thinking about all of this, I heard the most beautiful talk on the Upaya podcasts by Sensei Nanette Overley. And it's a story that encompasses much of the Dharma and what she calls what makes a true person. What makes a true person? And in the story that she's relating, it's actually called a real man, but because we have such difficulties these days with both that really gendered position, but also what being a real man can kind of mean in ways that are obstructive to us thinking of freedom. She calls it a true person. And it's such a beautiful story. So I wanted to tell you the story because I am fairly anecdotally driven. I like stories. And so for those of you who like lists, you've got a list. And for those of you who like stories, you're going to get a story. And Sensei Nanette says, the teachings are often vast and subtle, and we slide in sideways. You know, the family treasure doesn't come in the front door. So, you know, let's hoping we can slide together into this story. And the story comes from a book written by a man called Harry Roberts. And the book is called Walking in Beauty, Growing Up with the Yurok Indians. And Harry was born in 1906 to an Irish-American family. And his father went to work right over on the coast at a time when there were still a lot of indigenous people working in the fishing industry and the canning industry. So his father went over there to work and he went to live with him. And he grew up with other Indian children and fish, apparently, a lot of fish. And as he was growing up, even though he wasn't a native child, he was taught by a Yurok elder, a medicine man that he called uncle. And he was trained from childhood to be a real man. Or as the sensei puts it, a true person. In fact, Harry Roberts, who wrote the book, spent the last years of his life at Green Gulch. So there was a way for him in which this teaching absolutely kind of mapped onto the Dharma. And a true person can be described as an independent person whom others can depend on, who's going to live and be lived for the benefit of all beings. An independent person whom others can depend on. And a true person follows an important tenet in their ethics. And this tenet is that one's real self and purpose in life are one and the same. One's real self and purpose in life are one and the same. And it's a manifestation of the indescribable. We are a manifestation of the indescribable, which Harry called creation or pure beauty. That's why his book's called Walking in Beauty, and which Norman Fisher calls love. And well, there's many ways that we can describe the ineffable, the mysterious ineffable, and which is their way of describing reality as it actually is. A manifestation of the indescribable, which is reality as it actually is. And she goes on to tell the story, and the story is so like a koan. You know, it's interchanges between Harry, little Harry at 8 years old, and his mentor, the elder Robert. And this particular chapter that she's quoting is called The Brush Dance Wand. And Harry, in the way of these things, you know, the curriculum was not academic. The curriculum was following this guy around and seeing what he did. Was just immersing himself in Robert's presence and just noticing and seeing how he did things. And one morning, his uncle was very carefully preparing one of the very elaborate brush wands for the dance. And Harry looked, and one of the brushes looked perfect. And Harry said, "But it looks perfect, and anyway, it'll be dark. No one will know." And his uncle said, "Well, I'll know." And it gave him pause, and he said, "I think I'd like to begin giving you lessons in how to become a true person." And he held it up and he said, What is this I'm working on?" And Harry said, "Well, it's a wand." And then his mentor, Robert, said, "Well, I'm going to be asking you some questions so that you can learn about the law." And the law is their expression of the Dharma. And the law, as he understood it then, little Harry understood it then, was that it was one law. There was only one law, the law, and that was be true to thyself. So Harry said, "Oh, I understand that. It's quite simple. Be true to thyself." And his uncle said, "If you'd understood that, you wouldn't be asking me why I'm taking care to repair this brush wand. So let's start over. What are you holding? What am I holding in my hand?" And Harry says, "A wand." And then his uncle just carried on working. He went out to chop wood and to fish and do all the things that were needful to keep life moving in a rural world. And his uncle is really silent. And he goes out down to the river to fish for supper, and he still hasn't said anything. And so finally Harry says, "Why won't you speak to me? Why won't you speak to me? Have I offended you in some way?" And his uncle said, No, I just didn't want to offend you by interrupting your thoughts. Which was a bit of a puzzler for Harry. Hadn't been thinking about much at all. And Harry says, well, I answered you already. And so out of kindness, he wants him to wake up. His uncle asks him again, and the boy thinks. And finally Harry says, "It's a head one for the last night of the brush dance." And then, because he was trying so hard to be a good student, he gave him the answer that he thought his uncle would want. And he was trying so hard, and he said, "It shows how rich you are because it's the best and most expensive wand in the river." And Sensei Nanette says, and so poor little Harry fell off the cliff and into the river with that answer. And his uncle didn't speak to him for a few days. And then he said, "Well, I see you are just a small boy, and out of kindness, I'm going to tell you something about what this wand really is." And Harry was really trying to say what a real person, what a true person was, and really failing. And Harry said, "I was only a small boy, and so I just cried and ran and cuddled up to my dog and told my dog how hard it was to have such a great man as an uncle. And my dog understood and licked my face all over, and especially my ears." And his uncle said, "Now, if your ears are now clean enough, perhaps you can listen." And then he talked to Harry more about what the brush dance is, what a dance, which is a particular dance that's done for a person who has a sickness. And Uncle said on the last night of the dance, everyone brings out their very best costumes. These costumes represent hundreds of hours of very careful work. They are made of the rarest and most difficult to obtain materials. They've been kept in absolutely perfect condition, and never does a costume show any wear or that it has been used before. Everything is perfect. These costumes are the most beautiful things we have. Thus, when one dances in front of the sick person in the costume, it means that it has been cared enough for the patient that they've gone to all that trouble in the hope that they can help. Harry's uncle said, "How could I respect myself if I only went halfway or 3/4 of the way to help someone? If I'm not going to help all of the way, it's better that I don't go to the dance at all." So when I make a brush dance, the patient knows that I am all in. I am all of the way for them. I'm all of the way for them. That 100%, are you gonna give it everything you've got? And the patient feels reassured and will likely get well. Just that caring. So he said, this is what the brushed wand, dance wand represents. This is the way to be true to yourself. Now let's see if you can think like a true person the next time I ask you a question. And Harry writes that it was then that I saw that the law was not quite as simple as it appeared. I realized that as a true person, meant to be proud of yourself in everything you did, and you could never be less than all of yourself without breaking the law. A true person meant to be proud of yourself in everything you did, and you're never less than all of yourself. You could never do that without breaking the law. And it's a very interesting, for me, there's something about that sense of all of those qualities coming down to this idea of you could never be less than all of yourself without breaking the law. And there's so much dharma for me in this story. You know, the kindness of the teacher in his silence and his desire for him to grow. You know, and an expression of deep respect for the young child to support him to grow into a true person. And I'm really curious, I'm curious for myself, you know, and I'm really curious for all of us about what would it mean for us to live our lives by this way, you know, not by lists, but by committing to everything, all in, to be lived for the benefit of all beings. And it's in this really short space of time we have together. You know, lives feel long sometimes, but are pretty short. And I just wanted to cycle back to Flint's final sort of rendition of the three pure precepts. Preserve life. You know, take good care of it. Take care of the brush wand, even if no one's going to see it. You know, nourish life, encourage it and support it. You know, he really wanted to help Harry. Nourish life and plunge into life and don't hold back. How do we live this way? How do we live the law? How do we support each other to do that? So that's what I'm living with at the moment, under wondrous moon that's disappeared. So thank you all.